Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Garden and Country Extension webinar series. My name is Chris Jones. I'm with University of Arizona Cooperative Extension in Gila County. And today we've got a presentation dealing with how to deal with wildfire, the effects of wildfire, the recovery afterwards. So the title, When the Smoke Clears, The Road to Recovery Following Large-Scale Wildfire with Carol Icarius. She joins us from Colorado. Just a little bit about these webinars. They're a weekly Zoom webinar that I host. There'll be 60 minutes or less, Thursdays at 11 o'clock. They feature a variety of horticultural and natural resources topics relevant to environmental conditions and residential concerns of Gila County and others with similar concerns and conditions. Recording will be posted at this website, extension.arizona.edu/Gila, and the University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. Here's our agenda for the day. Thank you for logging in with us. A little bit of a lag time to get started. Again, my name is Chris Jones. I'm your moderator. The title of our presentation is When the Smoke Clears, The Road to Recovery Following Large-Scale Wildfire with Carol Icarius. She'll have about a 30-minute presentation for us, an interactive presentation, so I'm excited about this. We've got some brief updates and then an evaluation link, and I really appreciate people taking the time to do that evaluation for me. Open it up for some Q&A, question and answer time with Carol, and maybe we'll have some open discussion and then be able to wrap this up by noon Arizona time and get us off to lunch. This is our presenter. Carol Icarius is the CEO of a nonprofit called Coalitions and Collaboratives. She's out of Lake George, Colorado, as I mentioned, and this is her website, aftertheflames.com. And so at this time, I'm going to put up her presentation. I shouldn't have hit stop, she said new. We're all set here. And if this looks good to us, Carol, I'm handing it over to you right now.
Well, go ahead and put it into the, oh, it is, you got it in the present mode. Thanks. And thanks, Chris, for having me. If you want to go to the next slide, Chris is driving today, so we'll be doing back and forth on the driving of the program. A little bit about me. I have been intimately involved in about 20 or about a dozen really large wildfires over the years, to the point of, I know every drainage, I've walked them, I've dealt with post-fire floods, we've implemented projects, we've worked with property owners. I've advised on another 20 or so big fires around the country, work on national level policy around post-fire and recovery, and we've sponsored the After the Flames conference. The first one was a year ago. We had to cancel this year's due to the COVID-19, but we're doing a series of webinars on After the Flames, so I welcome folks to go look at the webinar schedule that's coming up and to sign up for those. And then we provide mentoring and support to local place-based natural resource groups, and particularly with the emergency response around wildfire. Next slide. And as Chris said, we'll be using Menti today. It's also in the chat if at any point in time you need the information again, but go to menti.com, best on your phone or tablet, but you can also do it off on the side on a computer. Once you get to menti.com, enter that code 630912. Next slide. What Menti does is allow actual, really in-time interactive participation regardless of crowd size.
Carol, I'm going to keep it right here just to make sure people have time to get onto their phones and devices. Look for menti.com and enter that code. I've got that information in the chat, so you can grab that in the chat and I'll move ahead. It looks like people are already responding, so I'll move that to the next slide.
So this gives me a way to get to know you all a little bit. So in that Menti window now, just who are you? Who do you work for? And as we see, this is a great sort of quick program that lets us gather information and see who people are and what their background is, and it'll help me understand who I'm talking to today. We have lots of, I'm assuming, University of Arizona folks on. That's awesome to see. Don't know who our other is. Any of our Fed, state, or local government folks participating? Any utility or tribe? Local nonprofits, citizens? One Fed. Give it another minute or so. How many folks do we have on altogether, Chris?
We are at 37 participants.
Okay, and
so
Shirley
they may be
raised her
having
hand.
some difficulty with this, and we'll
Asking for the link again. The link is on the top of the slide. Go to menti.com. And when you get there, so open a browser, go to menti.com. When you get there, go ahead and enter that 630912 into the code.
Yeah. So the code is right there. I'll go ahead and just put that one more time. And I bet you the thing is, we've just got a lot of people brand new to this technology. Yeah, there'll be no spaces in that code. And we're just getting introduced to it.
Yeah, and that's it. Now, as we're going to a virtual approach to meetings like this, we're all learning new tools, whether we wanted to or not.
And Carol, I did get to do this once earlier and got introduced to it. What I really like about it is its price. It does a really nice job, and I think there's another one. I'm trying to remember what the other one is, but it's like,
yeah, there's another one of these polling ones, and then there's a program called Mural that we use too sometime.
Well, look, I was comparing this and Poll Everywhere, and this was much more reasonable.
Yes, definitely. In fact, I ditched a Poll Everywhere account. So I think we can probably move on, but Shirley has raised her hand. So do we want to unmute Shirley and see what's...
Okay, let me see. Shirley, I've given you permission to talk. You'll need to unmute. You know what? Why don't we move ahead, and Shirley, you can come on.
We'll move ahead to the next one. And again, this is a second Menti to just see how it works. Somebody said they can't open two browsers at once. That's part of why I said it's usually easier to do it in a on your phone or on your tablet if you have that availability. And so this is more kind of what's your job in these different organizations? What do you do?
Okay, so let me see if I can get mine in here.
So we have lots of others. It would be interesting to know kind of what the others are. Probably since we've had a lot of educators, perhaps. I see at least one person who I know is a forestry contractor. So we have a variety of folks coming in on the list so far. And we've got good attendance with 36 at this point in time.
Yeah.
Arizona Master Gardeners, educators, environmental educators. Thanks for putting answers in the chat. For those of you who are listing as others, a Master Naturalist. Today we won't get into some of the deep bones on topics around long-term ecological recovery, and at least a few of you are probably interested in that topic. So you're welcome to reach out to me and we can have some more discussion around that. We'll touch on it a bit, but it's not going to get a lot of attention. Firewise Committee, that's awesome. All right, should we keep on going? Because again, we want to leave time for more interaction today. And you now have a feel for how Menti works.
I would imagine many of us are interested property owners as well. Okay, so this is our slide. You get us ready for this? I'm going to go ahead and load this up.
Go ahead and load this up, and while it's loading, I'll talk a little bit about it. So one of the things with these large-scale wildfires is they are all followed by what I would call surreal amounts of flooding that people can't even conceive of. I pulled this one. This is from Cochiti, New Mexico. It's a 2011 fire. They had a couple of inch rain up in the watershed where the burn was. What in normal times, this is sort of a dry wash in normal times, a femoral channel that would have some rain flow, but you can see the material coming down. You can see the debris coming along, burned trees, that kind of thing. 5 minutes into the flood, still raging and roaring. They look downstream, and you just see this amazing flood waters that happen. And so with every fire somewhere on that fire scar, in the next 3 to 5 years, you're gonna have a flood like this. Just look downstream at that, look what's going on and think, oh my God, this from a little dry wash that, you know, in normal times after a big rain, you know, maybe they're getting 10 CFS coming down this drainage. And at this point in time, this is probably 2000 CFS. If you don't know what a CFS is, it's a cubic foot per second. And what I tell folks is think of a basketball as about a cubic foot. That's 2000 basketballs zooming by you every second. Next slide. Okay, so your reactions: shock, devastating, wow. This is the type of thing, and people can't believe it until they see it. And people oftentimes don't believe it's gonna happen, and they'll say, well, if it floods. What I will tell you is it's not if, it's when. It will. Might not flood out of every single sub-drainage watershed that you've got up on the fire scars, but it will come out of some of these fire scar drainages within the next 3 years. I know you've had a few mud and debris flows on roads up in the fire yet, but you still haven't had the high intensity storm that causes this kind of flooding. All too common. That's somebody who's been around fires. And it's all too common. I know for Arizona, the one we always think of is the Schultz fire and the post-fire flooding on that. I looked for a good video of Schultz fire, but unfortunately there's not really a great video for that one. This Cochiti Canyon is a more dramatic representation as far as the video that was captured. So yeah, dangerous. I will tell you, you have no idea the power of water until you see this kind of a flood coming. And black water, this is not nice, clean water. When I start talking to local officials after a fire, I start talking about debris and sediment, and they go, why do I care about sediment, Carol? I'm worried about the flood. Well, their infrastructure, bridges, culverts, etc., they're designed for clear water flows, not these heavily sediment-laden flows. And the surprise of flood, somebody posted on the chat that there's, you know, it can happen in minutes. You go from nothing, from a dry gulch, to suddenly you have a massive flood water coming down. These floods do kill people. In Colorado, after Waldo Canyon, we had a fella killed along Highway 24. In Schultz fire, they had a couple of children killed in one of these floods. Anyway, let's move on. Thanks for participating in the word cloud around your reactions to the video.
Carol, I do want to point out one of the messages from Shirley. She mentioned a flash flood that we had at the place called Water Wheel, which is outside the Payson area last summer. And we lost an entire family that didn't know to get out.
Yeah, and it wasn't even a
Tragic.
post-fire flash flood, which is orders of magnitude bigger flooding. So this is what you have to look forward to. And thanks for that information, Shirley. And this is great. Please keep sharing in the chat box over there. Oh, but somebody says it was a 2017 Highline fire. Okay, cool. I learn these things sometimes just by doing these presentations. So one of the things we say is after a fire, you suddenly must do the things you cannot do. You go through life kind of, life is good, I don't care. And then all of a sudden you're forced into this, how do we deal with this and how do we ramp it up quickly and how do we address all of the issues? So next slide. And it says in chat the family was 10 people. Did it actually kill 10 people in one flood from the same family? That would be totally heartbreaking and tragic. The phases of disaster, pre-disaster, we're going along, we're minding our own business. The event happens, we all get into this heroic effort to address the fire itself. Suppression crews come in, everything, it's amazing. They get the fire in containment. There's this little short window of community cohesion, the honeymoon period, but then quickly the aftermath happens. And then you work through the grief and the challenges that these disasters have for many years to come. This doesn't just stop. And so understanding that it goes on and on is something to think about as you work through a post-fire scenario. Next slide. And it looks like I have an article I can read on what happened, and I will check out the Tucson Weekly article about it. Thanks to LA for sharing that. So what happens after the fire? First, the resources leave. So during suppression activities, you have all the people who come in from all the agencies. Most of them leave. You may have a smaller FEMA team left. You may have the BEAR team. You'll have some NRCS folks, but you don't have the robust resources that you had before. Yet that flood risk is extremely high. And that causes safety concerns for life, property, and infrastructure. And as I said, this isn't the first season or the second season. This goes on for years and years. And then you have the long-term effects to the community and the ecological effects. So the community includes, you know, the economic impacts, the social impacts. You'll have a lot of folks in a community who are suffering with PTSD from the event, and then even if they made it through the event and went, oh, it's all good, then they get into the flooding and they're re-traumatized by the flooding. Next slide. So the first task we want to think about on these floods is, how do we protect life safety? How do we reduce that chance of those folks being captured in the floodwaters and killed? Next slide. Life safety is really about looking around at the homes, the businesses, campgrounds, playgrounds, schools, and other at-risk values, and figuring out how are you going to protect them? What are you going to be doing? If you're in town, if you have a drainage that comes into a business community like shown here, this is Manitou Springs in Colorado, you know, really going door to door, working with the businesses on evacuation plans and preparedness. Figuring out if you have communities or subdivisions that are in these areas that are one way in, one way out property areas. Figuring out where you can land a helicopter to evacuate people if their roads are washed out. We do a lot of tabletops with residents in the most at-risk areas, so they actually start to think about things. If you have to hunker down at home, do you have enough of everything you need for a week or so? What if you go to work and you leave your kids at home? And you get trapped on the wrong side of the flood? How do you deal with that? Or you have an elderly parent at home who needs care. So those are things we ask residents in those areas to think about. And then we quickly get into sandbagging where we see those sites, and we try and do that. We don't even wait for federal money on a lot of those. The sites where we can do sandbagging quickly to help protect people and structures, we do that work as soon as we possibly can, oftentimes with a lot of volunteers involved. Next slide. Roads fail in these floods. Like I said, you know, culverts are designed for clear water flows. Bridges are designed for clear water flows. And they're designed for much lower flows because the fire changes the hydrology dramatically and for years. Again, it's not just a change for a short period. And what happens? They hit those culverts, they become a dam, then they wash out around the culvert. The culvert in that upper left picture was actually found about 2 miles downstream, stuck into the next bridge. And the lower left-hand corner, or the lower right-hand corner, I mean, is the Highway 24 coming out of Colorado Springs into the mountains. That's a highway that takes 60,000 vehicles a day in the summer. And this is what we were looking at with flash flooding and debris flows. Next slide. Again, just saying it another way. You know, you may have had a 24-inch culvert and you may end up needing a 20-foot box culvert. Oh, we got a poll question here. Not sure what happened.
Did I just lose the screen for us? I'm sorry.
You just lost the screen. It's one over on your tabs. There we go. So a lot of times if you're looking at these areas where culverts are going to fail, the thing we recommend to people is they put in low water crossings. And if you're working with NRCS, they won't pay to replace culverts, but they will help put in low water crossings. That requires some education though, so people know not to enter the low water crossing when it's flooding. But that is probably one of the most resilient answers in these types of areas. Next slide. We recommend that any kind of highway departments, public works folks, state highway, county people, tribes, anybody who has a road department has the signage and stuff ready to go to close roads quickly when flooding comes. And they should set a threshold working with the Weather Service on at what level they will do closures ahead of time. The question came up, what's a low water crossing? And you can go to the next slide while I'm answering that. This is an area where you harden the ground and you let the water run over it. So if you're used to driving around in the forest, you probably come across low water crossings frequently out in the woods. They're places that are just hardened so you can drive through. If it's a larger perennial water body, that's not going to work. But in these small ephemeral channels or very small normal perennial channels, they're a very effective way to get people moving back and forth. Controlled breaches of small dams or with larger dams, get them inspected by the state dam engineer. Because what happens is in floods, they start failing and then they cause a cascading level of flood damage downstream. So they're also one of the things we quickly look for, those stock ponds that ranchers have, stock fish ponds that maybe a camp or a subdivision has. And to the extent we can get people to breach them, we do. If we can't get them to breach those dams and do required maintenance on larger dams, we do really work with them to harden the overflow to try and keep the dam from failing in a flood. Next slide. And this is a quick chance for folks to get more questions or comments or observations in. Today, because we are going quickly, I may not answer all the questions that you come up with. But what will happen is I'll go through the questions and comments afterward, and I will respond to them in writing and get that to Chris, and he can get those sent out to the folks who are participating today.
Okay. Well, Carol, thank you very much. So sorry for trying to double task here. Usually I've given the screen to my co-host and then I can do a few things to get ready for, but that
Yeah,
was
and
fantastic.
partly, you guys, we were trying it off of my computer at home, but I live in the mountains in the boonies and my connection is sort of slow and was not participating. So Chris is doing double duty for us today.
Okay, so
Not seeing any, we'll keep moving on. If you do have some more questions, again, you'll have my email address to get a hold of me. But anything we do have, I will try and answer. So go ahead to the next slide, Chris. And the next part is pulling together stakeholders and creating a recovery plan. And having kind of a recovery team that's a longer term group of folks involved. Next slide. There's a lot of reasons to do this. First, you know, people think more holistically when they're in a group. You know, you need the utility companies there. You need different agencies and entities. Funding, it's easier to get funding when you have a group of people singing the same song to people like your senators and your Congress people about why you need funding, why you need help, where is that money coming to us from? You know, we need your help now. It's easier to do that if you're all singing from the same song sheet than if they're hearing 5 different people come in independently asking them for money for their interest linked to the fire. So when everybody puts it together as this is the help we need, you tend to get more help. Next slide. And who should be at the table? Basically, this is a quick list, but sort of everybody. You know, anybody who has anything to do with the land area, with the involvement with post-fire impacts, you know, invite them to the table, invite them to participate in this committee. The Army Corps of Engineers is spelled wrong, but they're a great asset. And they have special permissions for work happening after fires at a national level, so it can make 404 issues go away for you pretty quickly if they're part of your team. You know, hydrologists and district rangers, NRCS staff, because they have funding from the Emergency Watershed Program. Also, CERT is down here in the comments. And yes, National Weather Service, you guys, if you're part of a team, you need to get your local weather service folks involved. To us, they are just an amazing group for involvement in these things. But think broadly, think widely, invite everybody to participate. Next slide. Start the public meetings at once and talk about the floods honestly with people who live below those drainages. A lot of times, elected officials are oftentimes scared to say, oh, well, you know, we're going to have this flooding and it's going to be a problem. What I've found from the citizens who live in these areas, they welcome understanding their risk and having it really clearly articulated to them. They want to know, are they in danger? What are they in danger from? And so having those meetings as soon as possible is really valuable. A lot of times, as soon as the fire stops, the public meetings about the fire stop. Next slide. Chance for any questions or comments, suggestions for community communication venues. Part of what we've done over the years is we pull together these recovery teams. We'll meet at the county offices or at a fire district training room or something like that. We do publicize that that committee is meeting. But one thing about those committees, they usually do meet during business hours. So citizens don't necessarily get to participate in those meetings. Then in the evenings, we will do community meetings for the public. And we try to do them around different areas. For a bigger scar like you have with the bushfire, you know, we might do a couple of different spots for those meetings with the community members. Sometimes it can be a school cafeteria or a school theater room. Sometimes it's a county, again, commissioner's meeting room or someplace like that. But just making sure you're trying to reach out to the folks who need to know what's coming down the line. Next slide, please. So then getting the information you need, and there's a few pieces of information around burn severity, hydrology, debris flow analysis, and I'm going to quickly go through a couple of tools. You can go to the next slide, Chris, that are out there. But we don't have time today for a deep dive into any of them. So if these tickle your fancy and you want to reach out and you want more information, we could potentially schedule a separate webinar on a live demonstration of using some of these. But for now, I just want to touch on them. The BEAR report, or the Burned Area Emergency Response Report, is mainly focused on federal lands. All of the federal agencies, including BIA, have their own BEAR teams. And they have, you know, we work a lot with the U.S. Forest Service BEAR teams, but there are BEAR type folks for the different agencies. They do a lot of the post-fire hydrology analysis initially, and they do the analysis of debris flows. One of the problems with BEAR, though, is it typically stops at the burn scar, and it may even stop earlier on federal lands fence line. So the floods don't stop where the BEAR analysis stops necessarily. But the BEAR reports should be available from your local district ranger to help your community understand what the Forest Service does know about hydrology. Next slide. NRCS goes out, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and does EWP damage survey assessments. They look at things like what is going on that their emergency watershed protection program can help with to save life and property. And their process begins fairly quickly, often done by the local district conservationists for NRCS. It's a good place for folks with some knowledge to engage in the process. Depending on if your NRCS staff have had a lot of experience with fires, sometimes I find they don't necessarily know on their first rodeo what they're looking at as far as future flood risk. And that's reasonable. NRCS agents typically are dealing with farmers and ranchers and, you know, providing equip money to do projects on their farms and ranches, putting in new fencing, improved irrigation, things like that. They're not normally in this business. Next slide, please. USGS StreamStats is a tool that's online and anybody can use it, and it gives you a way to do hydrology analysis. If you just Google StreamStats, and this is one of the tools, we could do a separate webinar if enough people wanted to. Next slide. Going to have a couple slides around this USGS. I picked one sub-watershed that I delineated in the bushfire that comes down into Apache Reservoir. And so I go in, I drop a point in there that allows me to delineate a basin, which is what you see highlighted in yellow. So all of the area in yellow drains to that little blue blob next to the reservoir. Next slide, please, Chris. Then you can print out a report about that particular watershed that can talk about things like the area, the elevations, the total stream length, that kind of information. And then next slide. And then one of the important parts of these reports are the peak flood event information. But this peak flood event is pre-fire peak flood event. So if you look at a 2-year peak flood and based on the model used here in central Arizona highland area, the high end of a flood coming out of that particular area could be that 1060 number. So if you want to go to 2-year peak and PLU, Chris, and kind of point to that with your pointer, that's sort of a fast, high-intensity flash flood storm that would happen in this watershed in a 2-year rain event. So the rain event you see during monsoon season every other year. The post-fire number is going to be somewhere between 10 and 60 times that number. So if this is 1,000 basketballs would be flowing past that point per second in a 2-year peak flood before the fire, you know, it's going to be 100,000 to 6 million coming past there. So wrap your brain around that and then think back to that Cochiti flood video and think that's why I'm talking about this. A 10-year flood, you know, you're 4150, think of that as probably at the higher end of that 20 to 60 range. But that gives you a range of potential flood volume coming out of any of these sub-basins. And what we do with a flood is we work it all the way around and quickly gather this information to look at how we may see flooding coming out of sub-basins. Next slide. The other tool that we use, this is a USGS debris flow tool, again online, and this is the bushfire. So I quickly pulled this off of the USGS site. If you Google debris flows and USGS, you will find this site is available to the public. Go to the next slide, please. I'm going to kind of zoom into this in a couple of zooms. So you see this is the probability of a debris flow level flood coming out of these basins based on a 2-year storm event. Okay, so if we have that 2-year event, we have a probability of 0 to 20% out of some of these. Okay, then go to the next slide. We zoom into, again, this is that same area down by the reservoir that I looked at, but you can see some of those higher red areas with a 60 to 80% chance of having debris flows. So there's a good chance of the debris flow. Next slide. If it happens, this slide shows you the kind of volumes of debris that could come out of these drainages. And that dark red area is 10,000 to 100,000 cubic meters of debris. So bulked up sediment, trees, and anything else that's up there. If there's houses, if there's cars, if there's horse trailers, not well-built bridges, all that kind of stuff can come down in the debris flow. And people don't think in terms of cubic meters very often, but think in terms of a washing machine is about a cubic meter. So picture out of one of these drainages, 10,000 to 100,000 washing machines could come out in this flood analysis. That's pretty mind-boggling. And from protecting your reservoir and keeping sediment and debris out of your reservoir, if I had an interest in that particular reservoir, I'd be looking at how do I do work up above it to protect it. If that comes down into a community area, then I'd be looking at how do I protect those homes in that community area. Next slide, please.
Carol, could I share some things about the area that you've chosen to share
Sure.
with us about the bushfire? Just a little bit about these lakes, Roosevelt Lake and Apache and the others. These are on the Salt River system that controls and provides water for the Phoenix area. And Apache Lake is also very important because it's used for hydraulic power. And so looking at these types of stream flows, the disruption with that lake would be would have a lot of impact on the whole Phoenix area. So
Yes.
that's glad you picked this area. Also, Witano Basin is also very important because that's where our community is, but this is very interesting. Go ahead, I'll go ahead and forward. You're getting some chats in here too.
Yeah, and Kathy is saying it's also a very busy area for recreation. So thinking in terms of how do you have recreation people prepared for evacuation? What's the strategy?
Seems like we're on questions anyway, so go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so we'll go next slide. We'll skip because we're running a little late and I want to keep moving. Okay. We'll just skip that. Creating a recovery plan is one of the first projects for that recovery team. It's a multi-phased plan. It has to look at both the short-term initial things, what do we do right now, what's immediate, and then those longer-term things for ecological recovery and community recovery. Next slide. just a laundry list of the kinds of things that we think about in looking at recovery plans. So again, utility, restoration, and I would say in light of, you know, those reservoirs' importance to the Salt River Project, thinking about protection of those reservoirs as a utility piece. Expanded social, medical, and mental health services. Like I said, people have PTSD after these things. How do you deal with that with your community? Economic recovery, transportation, debris removal, building safety. All these different items have to get talked about, thought about. Who's the experts? Who can bring resources, even if it's mainly technical assistance and not money, to each of these pieces. So you might have on your restoration committee, you know, you may have the building department sitting there talking about what needs to happen for demolition of existing buildings and what has to be treated as hazardous. You might have highway department folks. Anyway, this is just a laundry list to give you an idea. Next slide. We're running a little late, so I'm going to skip the questions here. And then once you get that plan, it's time to get to work and do things. Next slide. So some lessons learned: start now, prepare to recover, you know, create your plan, look for community hazards, look for community engagement, give volunteers engagement. They want to engage after this. Having people who understand state and federal disaster recovery procedures is really important and will help move things a little faster. And when you're talking with Fed and state movement, it's never super fast. So the more you know how to work with that system, the better. Account, evaluate, mitigate, and repeat. This is an ongoing thing. Next slide, and I see some salt system reservoirs provide the majority of water supply. Salt River reservoirs provide the majority of water supply for the metro area, not part of the water supply for the Payson area. So, but Phoenix is a pretty important economic driver for the entire area, I would assume. And so looking at, sometimes it's not, might not be your water supply from that part of the fire. Though I'm guessing since you're on here, Joe, Payson may be impacted by other drainages with those same issues. So again, recovery should look at the entire fire and all of the communities around it. Spend some money on good assessments. They're going to help you prioritize the work, but don't spend all of your time and money analyzing down to the, you know, nitty gritty, looking at grains of sand between the weeds. So you want to do the 5,000 foot flyover assessment. That's going to help you prioritize things, but don't let the prioritization and the assessing take all of your time and not be getting any work done. Ask for help. There's a lot of folks, I'd be calling the folks on the Schultz fire and talking to them about their experiences. And remember, this is a marathon. This is going to take you years. Evaluate work. That helps you continue to improve. The entire state and valley residents are impacted by Phoenix, but they don't seem to worry or even be aware. Oh, hallelujah. People often are not. Next slide. And as you start doing work, really thinking about building for a better future, really thinking about, you know, don't just replace things as they are, but think about how do you build back more resiliently than you built in the first place. And can you develop a trained volunteer corps of leaders to be ready for the next event? Next slide. These are some of the things we've heard from other communities. Developing those relationships and communicating often, and don't put off hard decisions. It's easy for folks to kind of try and push them away because they're hard, but you need to be making them. Working on that public education component, we had lots of educators on here. We have some nonprofits on here. Those are folks who can help with that public education. Fire districts oftentimes end up responding to the floods, but I've not seen them be great at helping us educate the public on the flood potential. County emergency managers, though, can be really effective at helping with that education and outreach. Understanding the roles of your partners and who can bring what to the table, using volunteers, but doing so with care, both on the projects and on protecting the volunteers. These are often dangerous sites. So if you're working with volunteers out in the woods after a fire, again, having a relationship with NOAA where they know you're going to be out there, the OEM knows you're going to be out there, they can call you if the weather is changing to get you out of harm's way. And use the fire to change the future. Next slide. I have questions or comments, but I think, Chris, you wanted to open it up for a more open question and comments, so you can just leave my contact information there for folks. And if you want to open it, we got a little bit of time for open conversation and evaluation.
Okay, Carol, thank you much for your presentation. Learned a lot as well, and I think some of those comments, people seeing how this bushfire and how it can impact Apache Lake, that could be quite significant. And like they're saying, many people in the Phoenix area wouldn't know that's going to be the case until after the fact. So I'm sure our Salt River Project people, our Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, they've got this on their radar. They're working on it, but I haven't really been participating with them on this. So that was interesting. You picked it as the case study. So I think it opened a lot of our eyes. So I appreciate that. So what I need to do now, let me see how, I think I'm going to have to stop the share so that I can get our, the attendees up here. And what I have done in the past is I've asked people to go ahead and put a question into the chat box or in the Q&A. Particularly chat box is easiest for me. Then I can promote you to the, I can allow you to talk and we can have conversation with Carol. So put your name in there, what you have there as a participant. I can see you, and I can put your name in there, we can share it. And while we're waiting for that, I think we got a lot to absorb with this, because what you have behind me right now, this is the Globe Miami area. This is where I live. We have not had this wildfire yet. We are very concerned about invasive grasses that have come down and made these fires possible. The one interesting thing about that footprint of the bushfire, there was that one area that wasn't burned. I think that was something called the Edge Fire that happened about 10 years ago. It would have had those grasses in there, but that looked about where that fire happened. So somebody might be on the call that knows about that. But so
Shirley has.
I'm going to get Shirley up here while you respond to that.
Yeah, Shirley has a question about what happens to the debris. Shirley, you're live if you want to. Well, I'll talk about it based on what Shirley had put in the chat. And so, unfortunately, all that debris and sediment, and if a dam is challenged, this is why I say state dam engineers should be checking all of the bigger dams. It can actually destroy a dam. It can take out, and fairly large dams can be overtopped by these kinds of floods. And once they get overtopped, the dam weakens and can fail. So that is one issue about the debris hitting the dam. The longer term issue, generally those kind of bigger dams that belong to a major municipal utility are well maintained. So that's the good news. But what happens is all this debris and sediment takes up the capacity for storage in those dams. And that's a major issue for water supply in the West. I've often said the most expensive real estate in the Western United States is an acre foot of dam space. It is very costly. And so what happened after one of the fires in Colorado here, the Buffalo Creek fire, a fairly new reservoir built by Denver Water essentially was filled with sediment. What they had assumed would take, 1,000 years of normal erosion to fill this, to cause even impact in this dam to their water supply. When they did their analysis, it filled it in 2 years. They then spent $16 million trying to get 600,000 cubic feet of sediment out of the dam. That ended up turning around and not working. They got about 200,000 cubic feet out, and now a couple of years later, that's back in the dam. So it's a long-term issue for water supplies. Susan, evaluation, what's your question about it? And you need to unmute yourself, I think, right, Chris?
Yes. All right.
I was wondering about the form that we normally have to fill out for this. It's very, very interesting. And, I don't live where there's been any major fires, but we have washers that run right across our property. And when they run, we definitely cannot come home.
Right.
Susan,
So,
I'll get that evaluation link up here while Felicia asks her question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. This was very informative. I really appreciate it. And obviously, you're an expert at this. I love it. One of my concerns is I'm a sustainability scientist, and the unintended consequences of like Chris talked about, that invasive grass. I believe it was planted by the cattle ranchers for the cow, and now it burns. Of course, that's why everybody's asking why the bushfire burnt so badly here within the desert. But is this correct, that grass was invasive, is planted by cattle ranchers for their cattle, and now that's why it burns?
I think the unintended consequences of so many of our decisions come back and bite us in the butt as we move forward. And, my understanding is that, yeah, there are grasses now in that area of Arizona that were, planted for feed supply, and that have now become an invasive grass and that burn really well.
And Felicia, I can talk about this grass. And if you'll go to my website, I did have a person named Cindy Salo speak about the red brome, which is Bromus rubens or bromus anyway. She gave a presentation on that, and it wasn't necessarily one that was planted intentionally. And surprisingly, what surprised me is that the red brome has been in Arizona since the 50s. And in these last two events, this wasn't even the willow fire or the edge fire. That was primarily something called a schismus or a Mediterranean grass that helped to carry those. This one, I'd say just the weather conditions of, we had the storm, what happens is we get 2 wet winters in a row. One helps all of those invasive winter grasses be able to create a seed base, and then the next year they spread across. And particularly that woodbury fire, that invasive grass was in every void between the mesquites and Tonto Basin. I remember driving across that, and it was this real pretty purple, this red brome, but I was like, oh man, that's not going to be good. And then we had that woodbury fire. This red brome is now spreading, I think more so than grazing, it's getting spread through it's a light seed. It can spread by the wind, and then it gets spread down the roads. So roads are good vectors for spreading those seeds. Other ones that you do mention that have been used for erosion control, particularly the old dude fire, we put in layman's love grass. And that would be a good example of what you're mentioning, that was put in intentionally for erosion control. We thought we could use it for grazing. It did not end up being a great grass to use.
And then a lot of times, I think one of the things with these invasive grasses is they may have come in with hay originally. So something that came in the 1950s, you know, you may have had a drought year that year. Ranchers bought hay from out of state, from some other area. The hay brings in these kinds of invasive grasses and they get going. And Kit O'Connor is, I'm hoping Kit's with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, since he's talking about the surface fuels tracking tool that does allow for looking at these. And Kit, can you add a link into the chat for folks to where they can go to look at this information? But yeah, the research station folks, we work with them a lot from the Rocky Mountain Research Station around the country, and they're awesome scientists on these topics. So Kit, what have you got to add?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, no, I would just add, so first of all, you guys are both absolutely spot on with this complicated mix of introduced species that have, some have been around for a very long time, some only very recently introduced, like especially around the Tucson area and the Phoenix area, the really bad grasses like buffalo grass. And some of those were actually very intentionally introduced. But these last 2 years, last year was an El Nino, and this year was just an unprecedented heavy winter rain. We haven't seen fuel loadings like this since 2005. And a lot of these grasses were present back in 2005 as well, but there was this lull between 2005 and last year, the 2019 fire season, where we just hadn't seen this kind of grass growth in the desert system. And the expectation was last year was crazy, it won't happen again for another 10 years, and then this year was actually worse. So it was this strange combination of all of the wrong things being in the right place and this alignment. So that's been the concern. What's been nice is there is a new satellite tracking tool that can track the productivity of these areas remotely. And we actually get a rolling 2-week cycle of updates for productivity. And Matt Reeves out of the Rocky Mountain Research Station has been producing this specifically up in Region 4. So that's Nevada and the Great Basin area. But down where you guys are in Region 3, it's getting picked up now. And so we can start to track these things and know about these heavy fuel loadings 3, 4, 5 months in advance. So we know that fires are going to behave differently and hopefully give time to prepare for those fires in advance. How that affects these post-fire debris flows is a whole other series of questions.
Well, and on that, it doesn't necessarily affect the debris flows, but one thing about these fire scars that I will say is invasive species often come back quicker than the native species. And so you're going to start into a cycle of then you get even more of these grasses in the scar. And you'll see reburns. So New Mexico, I know, has had a couple of their big fires where then, you know, 3 or 4 years later, they have this really built up fuel load. And so they kind of keep getting reburns instead of getting regeneration back to the native ecosystem plant types that would have behaved better in fire in these communities. They're actually going in the opposite direction and setting up for even longer term ecological problems. And that's part of this, the discussion about, you know, how do we do longer term ecological restoration in these fires? The first couple of years, all we're focused on is mitigating the flooding, but how do we deal with that question longer term?
Could I add that as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing that we've seen exactly as you're talking about is these type conversions. And especially in these very sensitive ecosystems like the Sonoran Desert, they are not designed to burn at high intensity if they burn at all. And these grasses tend to burn at relatively high severity. And so we get a conversion where we remove or extirpate a lot of the native species that are there, and they really do come back as these nearly pure stands of invasive grasses. And it's not unique, unfortunately, to the Sonoran Desert also. This is also happening in the chaparral systems in Southern California, where we're seeing these large landscape grass conversions that burn much more frequently, potentially, than they did in the past.
Well, and here in the mountains in Colorado, we've seen conversion from ponderosa pine forest to now a grass shrub ecosystem on, hundreds of thousands of acres. So throughout the West, as we're seeing uncharacteristically big fires, we're also seeing uncharacteristic change in the ecosystem that is a longer term change, unfortunately. Elsa asks about how do we get the native species instead of the invasive ones. It is a combo of treating the invasives and strategically reseeding the natives. And it's not an easy process, Elsa. So another future webinar on long-term restoration might be good. I will put in a plug again for going to After the Flames and our webinar series, because this is one of the webinars we will be hosting. It won't be specific to your community and area, but later this year there will be a seminar on longer-term ecological restoration and fire scars.
Sure.
And Shirley adds that they use, weed killer treatments and sprays on those invasives and then try and get the seed going.
Carol, if you'd share those links with me, I can share them out through my listserv as well.
Awesome.
And I primarily promote these through my listserv and Facebook. I've got some great assistance with our local newspapers as well. So, and
the other thing I'll say about the After the Flames website, if you go to, again, aftertheflames.com, there is a resource area on that. So part of it will talk about the science or the symposiums and webinars, but there's a resource area that has a lot of resource information and kind of organized toward different audiences. So we had some interested citizens. There's some for interested citizens. If you're a specialist in one area or another, if you're a local government official, there's information sort of sorted for you on those. And we're at 1 o'clock. We definitely took your whole hour today, Chris.
that's okay. When it's fascinating, we did not have attrition. Everybody stayed on. We were up to about over 40 participants and we still got about 30 on here. I'm going to put up that evaluation link one more time in the chat. And here's Carol again and her website, aftertheflames.com. Let me see if I can move this on to the next slide. We've been having our Q&A. This has just been fantastic. So thank you very much. And people stick with me if you're concerned about invasive grasses and what's happening on the land, because this is a real concern of mine. And so I'm going to be having more discussion on the grasses. I actually want to get my colleague Kai to talk about using pre-emergence and just raise our awareness of what we can do about the wildfires that we're having. And this is a new problem with these grasses. So Elise Gornish or Dr. Elise Gornish. You know what? I did not change that.
She's not CEO of
COCO. Oops. Obviously, she's not the CEO. She's a colleague of mine at the University of Arizona. She's a restoration ecologist extension specialist. And she will be talking about the restoration approaches to manage bufflegrass and other invasive plants. And if you go to this website here, extension.arizona.edu, I'm going to change this because I hate when I have an error up there like that. I'm going to Carol back up here. But if you go to my website, I've got the August presentations up. So you can see what we're going to talk about. I've got some good stuff on gardening and more about what's going on with our natural resources. So Carol, thank you so much for your time today. I think you had a very
Thanks for having me. And again, if folks on the webinar want to reach out, go to the After the Flames website. There's a form you can fill out to get a hold of me. And I will try and respond. If Chris, you can get me the questions that were listed in the chat, I will try and get a little bit more lengthy response to some of them.
Very good. And what did you ask me to put your email in the chat?
No.
You'll just respond. I'll get the chat back to you and you can
Get
respond
the
back.
chat back to me and I will get you some email responses to share.
Anything you want me to share with the mailing list that I have, just send it to me and I'll send it along.
Yeah.
All right, let's wind this down. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close this. So, Carol, thank you. And how do I turn this off?
Y'all have a great day.
Everybody have a good day. Thank you very much.